Hello everybody, this is Dr. Wes Moore. I want to welcome you to this session today and really appreciate your time. In this session we want to start looking at the firm itself and talk about how economically we begin to generate a profit. So this is a very important concept for us all to learn. So let's go ahead and get started. In this lecture we want to talk about several things. First of all, we want to talk about revenue, cost, and profit as we look at the firm, how it's going to try and produce a profit. We want to look at these key terms: revenue, cost, and profit. Then we want to look at production in the short run. We're trying to produce things, make things. What do we need to keep in mind in the short term, the short span of time? And then we want to look at costs in the short and the long run. We want to look at factors and terms and ideas that come up relative to the costs that we will incur in both the short and the long run. First then, revenue, cost, and profit. I want to make sure that you understand some of these terms. There's some confusion in many places, particularly with the idea of revenue versus profit. So let's look at some terms to help us understand the basics here. First of all, revenue. Revenue is simply the total value of all that you sold in a particular period of time, generally a year. So that's what revenue is. So if I have made 1,000 cars and I sold 1,000 cars and they were $1,000 a piece, then my revenue would be $1 million. But that is not my profit, because I have to take out the second term, my costs, in order to determine what that profit is. So the costs are the total value of all the costs that I paid to execute that revenue. All the workers that I paid, the equipment, the rent, the insurance, all that stuff, those are my costs. And then when I subtract my costs from my revenue, then I end up with my profit. So profit is what is left after I take all of my costs out of the money that I brought in. And if I spent more in costs than I received in revenue, I have a loss. And if my costs are less than revenue, then I have a profit. Let's take a look at a couple of companies here and just kind of see what costs and revenue and profit look like in some big companies. This is Walmart in 2023. They had $648 billion in revenue. And people come along and say, oh my goodness, look how rich Walmart is. But look at its costs. Its costs were about 641 billion. My graphic is a little bit off there, which gave them about 6.6 billion in profit on $648 billion in revenue. That is only a 1% profit margin. That means that for every dollar Walmart took in that you bought, only 1%, 1 penny, ended up at the end of the year after all their costs being profit. So Walmart runs on very lean margins. And so when you hear people talking about Walmart needing to pay more, that they're keeping all the money back for themselves and they're not paying the workers fairly, hey, they're in a competitive market and they've only got a 1% profit margin. So I'm wondering where these big increases in pay are going to come from. Now let's look at Apple. Apple did $388 billion in 2023. Its costs were only $291 billion, which left it a $97 billion profit. Now that is a whopping 25% margin after all of its costs. That is incredible. So we see that these are two very big, very popular companies, but the profit margins are very much different. If you want to save money, if you want to go after somebody for having too much profit, you should look at Apple and not Walmart. But I'm a free market guy, so I don't want you going after anybody for the profit. I'm glad Apple's able to make that profit, and I want to see more companies make more profit. We're going to talk about why in a minute. So the question here is this bad? Is it bad for companies to make a profit? More and more today in our country, we see people hating on profit, people thinking profit is evil, profit is greedy, profit is wrong. But that is just an incredibly naive and foolish way to think. Profit is not optional. Profit is something that is required. Let's look at a textbook here, macroecon William McEachern. He said this about profit. He said, with supply, we're talking about producers, companies like Apple and Walmart and so on, we assume that producers try to maximize profit, and this goal motivates their behavior. Over time, firms that survive and thrive are those that are more profitable. Unprofitable firms eventually fail. Now let's look at this. He says that firms that survive and thrive are the ones that are the most profitable. One of the analogies that I learned many years ago is that a company is very much like a human being. A company is like a person's body. It can be healthy, it can be strong, it can be sick, and it can die. And profit is that thing usually that determines whether we're healthy, whether we're in trouble, or whether we're going to die. And when you look at a company like Walmart, for example, and you see a 1% profit margin, to me that's a concerning thing, because there's no room for error, and they're not that far from failing if they don't get that profit margin up. So unprofitable firms eventually fail. So we need profit for companies to continue to exist. If you want companies to continue to exist, and we're going to talk about some of the benefits of companies existing and making profits here in a moment, then we need to stop thinking of profit as evil. Not everyone who tries to earn a profit is evil. Not everyone who seeks profit is greedy. We have to have profit to keep our companies going and to have money to invest and so on. In fact, firms will never get started without profit. You would never see a company starting without profit. Why? Well, because of what we're learning in our course and study of economics, opportunity cost. Why would I go out and start a business, leave a good job, start a business, take all the risks, spend all the time, and then not be able to earn any profit? That doesn't make any sense. I would never do that. You wouldn't do it. No one would do it. You would just stay with your current employer if you could, and you wouldn't go and start anything because there's no incentive. Remember the law of incentives, incredibly important. And one of the reasons that free markets are so good at creating wealth, creating value, creating opportunity for people is because of the law of incentives. We have the incentive to do so. And I want you to think about the good things that come from profit. Profitable companies stay in business, profitable companies grow, and they create jobs and opportunity for people like me and you. Those of you listening to this lecture, how many of you are working and benefiting from a company that is run well and making profit? Walmart, for example, employs 2 million people. It's 2 million people getting salaries, getting benefits, all the things that come with a good job. Apple, 164,000 people. Amazon, 1.5 million people. Without profit, all of these companies go away, and all of these, nearly 4 million jobs, disappear. We need profit. Income and benefits. Profitable companies can provide benefits for their employees. You get a salary, you may get a bonus, you get health insurance, retirement benefits, matching funds, and so on. All of that comes out of profit. If you're not making any profit, then you have to cut back on your salaries, cut back on your bonuses, cut back on your insurance and the things that you offer because those cost you things. And then tax revenue. Where does the government get its money? It gets its money from taxes. And so profitable companies pay taxes on those profits. And profitable companies hire people who then pay taxes on their income. And so the government is able to gather together money to build roads that we need, to provide for our defense against our enemies, and to fund the government itself, which is important. To help the poor. Where does the money come from for the poor? It's got to come from taxes. And there is no tax without profitable companies. And then Social Security and military benefits, again, all that comes from taxes. So profit is very important. Profit is not a bad thing. And the market itself tends to limit the amount of profit companies can make. If you look at Walmart, you see they certainly don't want to make 1%. It's just a tight competitive market. So that's all they can pull out of that market. So in a free market, it's very hard for companies to take advantage and charge prices that are exorbitant and make huge profits on a continual basis because there's too much competition. Let's turn and let's talk a little bit more about profit. We have different terms that we use for profit. There's a term called accounting profit and there's a term called economic profit, and they're important to understand. Let's go and let's look at this costs line here. Let's think about costs for a moment. When we look at this, we see revenue and cost and profit. There are explicit costs. Explicit. These are the actual payments that we make running our business for the cost that the things that we need to buy. So when we're buying our labor, we're paying wages, the rent, capital to buy equipment, insurance, interest on loans, and all that. That's stuff that we're actually writing checks for and we can count every year. And then there are what's called implicit costs. Now we're going to tie a little bit into our economics here. This is the opportunity cost of using what the firm has, the company has, the way it's currently using them, as opposed to some other way to use them that could produce income. So for example, if I leave my job, let's say I'm making $100,000 and I leave my job to start a business. Well, I am giving up $100,000 to start that business. And so that is an implicit cost of me starting that business. It's not going to show up in an accounting report, but it is not still an actual cost to me, something I'm giving up to start my business. So the question that we want to ask, we're talking about accounting versus economic profit, is what about the money that could be generated with these resources otherwise? Are we really using these resources in the most effective way? So my resource of my time and my skill, am I using that the best in my starting a new business, or am I using that the best if I work for someone else? If I take my money and invest it in my business, I could also take that and invest it in the stock market or in some kind of interest-bearing account. Which is the best? Accounting and economic profit start to answer this question. So let's take a look here. Let's look at another example. Let's say that I'm going to start a business and I'm going to start a tree service. I'm going to go around and cut down trees out of people's yards and things like that and try and make some money doing that. And let's say that 1 year in my business I have a revenue of $900,000. Now my costs are $750,000. And so that gives me a profit of $150,000. That sounds good, right? And it is good. But that is an accounting profit because it does not take into account any of those opportunity costs that I just talked about. It only deals with the explicit costs only, the things I wrote checks for to pay. All right, so that is what we call an accounting profit. It takes into account the explicit costs only. But let's look at some implicit costs here. Let's say that I was making $100,000, so I gave up $100,000 to go into this business. Let's say that I could have earned $10,000 in interest in the money that I used to start that business. And let's say that I gave up $5,000 in retirement income. So my company is going to match my retirement or something like that. So I'm walking away from all that money. And when we are talking about economics, we're taking into consideration all of our costs to determine whether or not we're really running a true profit, what we'll talk about here in a moment. So in this, we want to add in those implicit costs there. I just put that as I-costs. That's the implicit cost. We add that in, and then we see down here at the bottom my profit. When I consider all of that, I have to take those out. Is called the economic profit. Economic profit. And so that is explicit and implicit costs taken out of my revenue gives me my economic costs. So let's look now at this in another way so you can see it graphically. So an accounting profit, I'm going to take that total revenue, the orange and the blue represents all the money that I brought in, and I'm going to take out my explicit cost, that's the blue, and what I'm left with at the top is in the orange is the accounting profit. But the way this looks with an economic profit is I've got my implicit costs then come out. So I've got my explicit costs, those don't change, that's the blue. But now I'm going to take out my implicit costs, and then whatever's left, that orange on the top, is my economic profit. So that's another way to visualize what we're talking about. Now what if, once I take into consideration my implicit costs, leaving my job, interest, anything else, any other factors like that, what if I don't make any economic profit? What if my implicit costs take up all of my accounting profit? You see here we've got the green on the top of that bar chart there, but we've got no orange. So that's a zero economic profit, which means when I take all my implicit costs into consideration, I'm break even. Or what if my implicit costs cause me to go into negative economic profit? In other words, basically I'm losing. When I left all the stuff behind and I moved over to this new thing, I actually lost money in total. Not on paper, but in total I did. What should I do if I'm breaking even or I have a negative economic profit? And this is where the concept of economic profit is helpful. What I should do is close the business, because I can make more net. At the end of the day, I'm going to make more if I'm using my resources, my money, my time, my skill, working for someone else. You see that? So you can make more using the resources on other things, working for someone else, and earning interest. So that's what it helps us to see. Basically, it says, look, I'm doing all this work to start a business, but if I just went back to work for somebody else, I actually would make more, and I would have less trouble. So that's one of the ways that economic versus accounting profit can help you make business and really life decisions. So let's move on now and let's look at production. Let's look at production, producing things, making things, creating that value that you're going to sell to customers. Let's look at it in the short run. All right, so let's talk about our resources, the kinds of things that we're going to use to create that value for our customers. First of all, we have variable resources. Variable resources. And what that is a resources that we can change quickly to change our production. They're variable. I can quickly move them. If I do a lot, I spend a lot. If I don't do much, I don't spend much. Those are my variable resources. So that would mostly come down to things like people, labor. So if I'm having a big, selling a lot of burgers, I can hire a couple more workers and bring them in. And then when things slow down, maybe in the fall, I'll let them go. That's a variable resources. I can change that quickly to change my output. But we also have fixed resources. Fixed resources I can't change very quickly. So let's use the restaurant analogy. I'm making burgers. I can hire people, but I can't cut my building in half and only pay half my rent very quickly. I can't move to a bigger facility very quickly. I may not be able to put in an entire new stove and deep fryer very quickly. Those are more fixed resources. All right? And the short run and the long run in economics are based on these two ideas. The short run isn't a specific amount of time. It's not 3 months or 6 months or 1 week or 2 weeks. It's basically whatever time I need to change my variable resources. So the short run, I can change variable resources, but I can't change fixed resources. That's called the short run. And the long run is enough time for me to change anything. In enough time, I can sell my building. In enough time, I can put in that entire new kitchen. So in the long run, all resources are variable if you give me enough time. All right, so that's short and long run. Now, when we're talking about our resources and using our resources, there's something called the law of marginal returns. This has to do with mostly with labor, variable resources, things that I can change quickly. Let's look at this. All right, there's a law called the increasing marginal returns. So basically here, when I've got this variable labor, I've got variable resource like labor, what I can do is I can improve my productivity if I add another variable resource up to a point. So remember, margin in economics, the margin means the next one. So the marginal employee is the next employee. The marginal burger is the next burger I make. The marginal cost is the cost of the next thing that I'm measuring. All right, and so when I've got these labor and I've got my restaurant and I want to make more burgers, at some point I can add another cook and get more burgers produced in an hour. All right, that's called increasing marginal return. I'm getting more return every time I add one more worker on the margin, the next one. All right, but at some point I lose that benefit. That's when I add another unit and I decrease the number of burgers that I make. This is called the diminishing marginal return. The return I'm getting for adding another worker is going down instead of up. And this is the example here is in that kitchen, I can only get so many people in there. So if I keep adding cooks, at some point they're going to be falling over each other and they're not going to be able to be efficient. So I'm going to have a decreasing return on my variable input, my variable resource, which in this case we're talking about is labor. So this brings us to a law, the law of diminishing marginal returns. Basically, as you add more workers with the same amount of equipment and space and facilities and all that, fixed resources, you're eventually going to produce less. So you have to keep that in mind. To overcome that, you have to take more capital, more money, and create more floor space, maybe a bigger kitchen, maybe different kinds of equipment with different technology, maybe different facilities. Okay? The law of diminishing marginal returns has to do with production. And it means that at some point when we add more workers, we get less out of them. And that's something that we have to track and be aware of. Now let's finish up here briefly talking about costs. We're talking about resources. Now let's talk about our costs in the short and the long run. First, costs in the short run. Well, as with resources, we have variable costs. Variable costs. These are costs that are dependent on our production. And we only incur those costs when we produce something. So if I shut down the restaurant and send everybody home, my variable costs go to zero because I'm not producing anything. That's a variable cost. So labor, if you're making French fries and you stop production, you don't need any more French fries, that kind of thing. Inputs. But then you got the fixed costs. Just like with resources, fixed resources, got fixed cost. So I can send everybody home, but I still have to pay my rent. I still have to pay my insurance. I still have to pay my taxes and things like that. So those are fixed costs. Now total cost is when we take variable cost and add it to fixed cost. Those will be our total costs. So in a month at my restaurant, I'd have my lease payment and my insurance payment. Those are my fixed costs. And then I'll have my variable cost, the cost of all my employees, the cost of the French fries and the burgers and the buns. Add those up, and that's my total cost. But even when nothing is produced, I still have to pay my fixed costs. That's important. And then marginal costs. We've talked about margin already. That's the cost of the next unit, the next burger I make, or the next tree I cut down, or whatever the case is. Those are our types of short-run costs. And now cost in the long run. Well, as we said, there really are, all costs are variable in the long run. You can sell your building, you can do whatever you need to with your costs, with your fixed assets. But really, in the long run, we're going to talk about something called economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. That's really what we're talking about as the company grows over the long run. How are we doing with our production? Are we getting better and being able to purchase more, make more because we're getting bigger? Are we starting to get bigger but we're producing less? Let's look at these terms briefly and then we'll wrap this up. Economies of scale is when you get larger, your costs fall per unit and you're able to expand and do more. You're getting bigger, and that's making you better at your job, more productive and more cost effective. Example here would be larger machinery, greater specialization. You've got, instead of one employee doing 3 jobs, you've got 3 employees doing those jobs and they do it better and faster. Your equipment is bigger, it's more technical because you can get more money, you can borrow more from banks and get better equipment. That's economies of scale. Diseconomies of scale is the opposite, when our long run average costs increase as we get bigger. And this basically, you just get too big. There is such a thing as being too big. Coordinating all those people and all those departments, communicating between them, keeping them all going in the right direction, measuring them becomes very hard as you get to a certain point. So it's not always good to just get bigger. I want to point out here that diseconomies of scale are very common in government, because government just seems to grow and grow and grow and grow, particularly national governments. When governments become too large, they cannot be completely managed or held accountable, which results in great inefficiencies, waste, and fraud. For example, our federal government is millions of people with thousands of departments, and there's no way to manage that well. There are naturally going to be great diseconomies of scale, and that's why we want to make sure we don't let government get too big. Well, that's the end of our session together, and I really appreciate you joining me today, and I look forward to our next session.